This is what you know about Boston. This is not all of Boston.
When people hear about the Boston that they don't know about has been kept from them, that they actually work in and walk through every day, they're usually in shock and they're disappointed in themselves for not knowing. But I remind them that there's no way you would know. There's no signage, you know. A lot of the people in that community that lived there weren't there during this era. Boston doesn't feel the need to highlight anybody that doesn't, you know, fill that status quo idea of, you know, what a Bostonian is, Paktakad Havajad, you know? Like, I grew up and has been raised in the heart of Boston, and if somebody had an accent like that, we looked at them like they were weird. Like, how did you get that?
I grew up in Chicago, so my norm for black was Black American. If I went to a cookout, I knew I would hear Frankie Beverly and Mays. Going to a cookout here in Boston may mean I may hear soca, I may hear Romeo Santos. So it's a different experience because there's such a global black diaspora experience here in Boston, particularly with so many different cultures from the Caribbean and other places.
I didn't know that much about Boston growing up. I only really knew about Paul Revere. I knew the Redcoats are coming. I had seen the picture of Ted Landsmark by Stanley Foreman, where he was getting stabbed with the American flag. I didn't know that Dr. Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King studied here, met here, fell in love here, and began this incredible journey here in Boston.
For those of us that are not native to Boston or not familiar, we know Boston as a place of racism. That's just the simple, quite shared public knowledge about how we see Boston. Before I started to live here, everybody said, "What you going to Boston for?" People don't go to Boston. Black people don't live in Boston. Black people exist in Boston.
When people outside of Boston and Massachusetts think of black, they don't think that anything ever happened here. They don't think there's a thriving community here, and they don't think there's any history here. But it's crazy because when I was a kid, I was immersed in it.
You know, it really is the communities. I mean, we could easily say the black community, but we know the black community is not a monolith. So, you know, there are a number of communities, and Boston right now is more diverse than it ever has been, but in many ways is still very segregated, as it's always been. But inside those communities are just rich cultural expressions of what it means to be a Bostonian, which is very different than what it meant when I was growing up in the city.
When you walk the streets, you didn't see black people. You know, you go to Philly, you go to Atlanta, you go to these places and you're steeped in blackness, right? And in Massachusetts and in Boston in particular, you don't feel that. In the downtown area, for a very long time, you just didn't see Black people?
It's hard for Black people who who weren't alive, let alone lived through the beginning of this, to realize that there was a time there were no Black people living on the other side of Columbia Road from Roxbury. None. You crossed Columbia Road, and it was like you were in South Africa and had just walked into the white part of Cape Town. I think sometimes we thought that was out of the ignorance of white people, rather than know that's purposeful.
So there is this perception that we're not here. I think unlike other parts of the country where there has been more integration of neighborhoods, that really is not so well done here in Boston, and that's a function of housing patterns, investments, and the way government has operated. We're also a city of neighborhoods and tribes.
When I arrived in Boston, the Black community was rather isolated from the rest of the city. But it was something of a joyful isolation in that there were clubs, there were social settings, there were beauty parlors and barbershops, grocery stores, churches, where we could feel comfortable and where there was a strong level of economic development in the community itself.
You know, I don't think there ever was one Boston. I think people created their Boston in different parts of the city or by the things that you affiliated with. Even the parts of Boston that nobody wanted to live in have become high rent districts. There are houses selling for $1 million in Roxbury and Dorchester. And now the people who left because it wasn't good enough for them are crying because they can't afford to come back. And so it's trying to figure out, how do you bring together new Boston with, old Boston, with changing Boston, because now we're seeing another wave, and this is the gentrification wave, which is pushing everybody in a different kind of way and bringing a whole other group of people who are here for convenience versus community.
Established in 1634, Boston Common is America's oldest public park. Puritan colonists purchased the land rights to the Common's 44 acres from the first European settler of the area. The Common was a site for puritanical punishments, home to a whipping post, pillory, and stocks. Pirates, murderers, and witches were hanged from the tree known as the Great Elm. This is what the internet will tell you about Boston Common. What it won't tell you is that in 1953, in this very park, two stalwarts of civil rights in America defined the possibilities of their future. Along these windy, narrow paths, Martin and Coretta Scott fell in love.
We are gathering on what would have been Mrs. King's 95th birthday. We are here to celebrate the next chapter in our city through the Embrace Memorial. The Embrace was created to honor the legacy of Coretta Scott King, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and their time and work here together in Boston and beyond.
The Embrace represented that distillation of gesture. This monument will create a new and disruptive presence in our city. I'm reminded that when the Eiffel Tower opened, critics in Paris said it was a monstrosity, a gesture against the city. And when you think of Paris, the first thing that comes to mind is the Eiffel Tower. So I think we want to do that for Boston.
From the beginning, we knew we wanted to make it big. We knew it was important to tell this story, and the best way to tell a story in Boston is having it take place at this historic park, the Boston Common, America's oldest public park. There's about 6 to 7 million folks that visit Boston and walk through the Common, both folks who live here every day and visitors. And so to have this memorial on the Freedom Trail, have this memorial on the Black Heritage Trail, to have this memorial steps away from where Crispus Attucks was killed, right? To have this memorial on hallowed ground at this resting point, to have this memorial in the historic land of the Massachusetts people, we knew it was important for it to be accessible to all of us. And Boston Common felt like the most ideal place for that to happen.
And I'm sitting here imagining, okay, this thing's gonna go up in a green space that historically hasn't been really nice to Black people. Interesting. Okay. And then we're going to amplify Black love. We're gonna amplify the history of a husband and wife, a mother and a father, legacy builders, a son and a daughter. Like, woo, it's got layers to this.
Really about respecting the agency of the people in these communities. We're not all poor, we're not all broke, we all have possibilities. And we need to remember that there's more to us than that. And what I love about this project is that it really pulled us and helped us understand what our possibilities are. Because, you know, if the folks that came before me didn't rely on what was possible and got stuck on what it is, we never would have been able to accomplish all that we've been able to accomplish. And that's what this really represents. That we had to challenge ourselves, Black people. We had to challenge ourselves about not saying, well, let's put it in Roxbury. Let's put it in Grove Hall. Let's put it where we all sit. It's this expansion of ourselves where we understand that the city is ours, that Boston Common is ours, the financial district is ours. We're not visitors.
I think that there are mythologies that place Black people in the space of being minority. That's a particular word that minimizes and limits who we are. And I hear many of us taking that rhetoric and describing ourselves rather than embracing our own presence and largeness. Like, just even contemporary, murder pan. How dare you call where I live murder pan? I live in Mattapan if I live in Mattapan. From the ravages of slavery and the impact of what has been a hate campaign against us, we have these things now to mount campaigns against. But I think that we have to affirm ourselves in our own minds and dispel the places that people have tried to relegate us to.
You know, the restoration of pride is a work in progress for people of color here, specifically Black people. And I feel like if we do not do enough bragging like a Philly or Chicago or an Atlanta, we'll have nothing to claim in a few short years.
Much of what we talk about in Boston is in, the center of Boston, downtown, and not in the neighborhoods, but the neighborhoods is where it's at. And so, I think about my own neighborhood of Roxbury and the history of Roxbury. Roxbury is as old as Boston. Both were founded in 1630. And there's just so much history. And you can see it in the architecture, you can see it in our monuments and in our art. And so I hope more people come to Boston to explore and experience our neighborhoods.
Dorchester, Roxbury, Mattapan, Hyde Park, Rosendale, South End, Jamaica Plain. These are some of the neighborhoods that make up our city, but you're not gonna hear about them in typical Hollywood scripts. These are the places where Black folks in our culture are celebrated and not just tolerated.
I encounter a lot of people who only know the sort of white history of Boston. So when they learn about these other things, they're appreciative of learning something new and something they can research. But it's also, I want to say like a bit of shame or guilt because they felt like they should know.
I used to do tours and I would point out to people, this was the NAACP building, and a lot of people think of the NAACP as being based in New York when actually most of the people who founded what became the NAACP were from Massachusetts or especially Roxbury. I point to 538 Mass Ave, which was, a place where people used to gather, and it's also where Martin Luther King's future wife, Coretta Scott, actually lived at one point while he was living on Mass Ave, after she moved from her dorm. 538 Mass Ave should be a museum. It isn't.
For me, growing up in the city, the Sitco sign above Fenway Park was so iconic. We used to love how it would light up. Whenever we were driving in the car with my dad, we would point to that sign. But the Simcoe sign on the Mattapan Bridge was just as iconic to me growing up in the city of Boston. And we don't talk about the Simcoe sign. We don't see the Simcoe sign on postcards. We don't have it on T-shirts the way we have the Sitco sign. To me, both of those signs are iconic and they represent Boston, but we only talk about one. And I think that speaks to this stereotype of Boston just being Fenway Park, the Sitco sign, the Charles River, and all of those things. I love all of those things, don't get me wrong, but we're so much more than that.
First of all, you want to be respected, you want to be valued, and you want to see yourself in the experience. And so I think particularly if you're born and raised in Boston, after knocking your head against the wall for so many years, you just want to go someplace else where it's not as hard.
22,000 people. The mile of marchers from a playground in Roxbury to that bandstand in the rain to make their point heard about the fact that the time had come for radical change, not just here in Boston, but across the Commonwealth and throughout the country. And the fact that this is a direct sight line from that very special and important moment here in the Commonwealth, once again, is a beautiful statement about what this is all about, what it represents in the history and the opportunity and the possibility that it represents going forward.
I remember when we heard on the news that there was going to be a march with Martin Luther King going to the Common, and it was going to pass not too far from where we lived. I think we were at the beginning of understanding that what was going on in the South, which you saw on the newspapers, you saw on TV rather, those same issues, and maybe in slightly different ways, were playing out here. And so we had watched marches on television, but to know that there was a march being organized and that literally would be coming past near where we lived was both exciting and frightening all at the same time. The energy, the positive energy of the crowd made you feel part of something, but not always clear at a young age as to what you were going to be able to do with it, but understood that people were fighting for things to be better.
We are in Walla Walla, Washington to check out the Embrace. The Embrace will be in a few pieces, and so it's the first time that Boston has seen a monument of this magnitude. And so I'm excited to share this with fellow Bostonians. Take a journey with us, and we're excited to see what happens next.
I did take a walk through downtown Walla Walla and found out about the Walla Walla Native American tribe and the other 4 tribes that were in this area. That this was the tail end of the Northwest Passage, Lewis and Clark and all of that. We always remember our Native American brothers and sisters, and we should remember them tonight.
Amen.
And so if we can have a quick prayer for this food, for this fellowship, for the emerging friendships and the bond that will endure. We thank you for all these things, oh God. And let everyone say together, amen.
Amen.
Leslie.
As somebody at King Boston, I was so surprised that so many people did not know that they met in the city of Boston.
In Boston.
And that obviously people knew that Dr. King came to Boston to get educated, but they didn't know that that's where they connected.
And they met at 12th Baptist.
Yes.
The secretary of the pastor was at the New England Conservatory, and King was a young doctoral student, and he sort of let it be known that he was looking for a wife. Hey, it's the 1950s,
so
all right?
Dr. King asked his homegirl to hook him up.
Right. And so she goes to the conservatory and grabs Coretta, and they meet at the church, and then they go have coffee, right? And while they're having coffee, he says, "You don't know it yet, but you're gonna be my wife," right? And she said in her memoirs, she wasn't impressed the first time she saw him. But they kept going, and things, one thing turned into another, and then voila, they fell in love, and that was it.
While it is really very much about and inspired by the Kings, it also is about all of us, and it's an invitation for us to step inside this story of their love and their love for one another, and how that translated to love for community and love for the world.
Over 430 Confederate monuments built in this country, 240 schools, elementary, middle, colleges, high schools, named after Confederate leaders. And so imagine us as a city, a storied, historic city, creating a memorial post-pandemic that represents love.
Well, we need to create that celebration that brings kids to that brings families.
Someone's gonna get married there. There's gonna be some protests. There's gonna be a bar mitzvah. There's gonna be a baby shower. There's going to be presentations. There's gonna be spoken word. It runs the gamut.
There are so many monuments that kind of are memorials, but this is really intended to really celebrate not only the Kings, but also their legacy and how their legacy plays out in our lives.
We were concerned about getting through the public process because, not everybody wanted to see a new statue on the Boston Common, so there was some feelings around that too. There were some feelings. I'm just going to say that.
Not only is the memorial honoring the Kings, it's honoring 69 other civil rights leaders from the 50s, 60s, and 70s that marched alongside of King, that did their work before King, returned in 1965, and that continued the work for Boston after the Kings left the city. Part of the concept of this, and we're almost standing in the center. These will be buried, and so the idea that we're standing in the center of a hug. It's meant to be touched, and as the patina on the bronze changes, you'll smell it. So all of your senses will be ignited. We're creating an app, a digital app, and so there'll be a mobile experience. And so for folks who are visually impaired, they'll be able to experience and have this experience be described to them.
This angle right here, that's the first thing I saw. And so the scale, just almost took my breath away. And then I kept hearing Amari saying something. I couldn't even hear him because I was like, this is ginormous.
I know initially in those conversations, a lot of it was like, hey, we love the idea of the memorial, but as a city, we need more. Yep. So it's not only that we've got a memorial, but we've got an organization that was born out of that as well. So how does that fit in the scheme for you?
To me, if I was able to lay out a blueprint for how this would happen, it would happen just like that. And that it's happening like that, to me, is like, an amazing thing. Because I remember the conversations. I mean, people were like, yeah, this would be fine, and then there were folks who were like, well, maybe it should go into Roxbury. And I'm like, no, that kind of affirms the whole racial balkanization thing that we're trying to get away from, right? And then there were folks who were like, you'll never get this on Boston Common, right? And after a few years, we were able to, get the approvals, for that. So the fact that we were able to get it on Boston Common we're able to have an organization that will actually begin to explore and realize where Dr. King was going in 1968 before he was assassinated, which was around economic empowerment and economic development and equity, for all. And that, folks can start at the Common and then end up in Roxbury, hopefully at the P3 site. And then they'll be able to see for themselves that, there's something going on in this city.
I got a call at 8:30 this morning, and someone said, "Hey, I'm here in town, and I'll see you later." And I didn't know who it was. And so I said, "All right, well, I'll see you later." And they said, "It's me, Hank." And I was like, "Oh." I was like, "Oh, I thought you were talking to someone else." Like, "No, I'm here in town. I'm gonna see you later for real." I was like, "Why didn't you call me last night?" He's like, "I literally got here and wouldn't miss this moment for anything." And so it's my pleasure, and I'm gonna invite the entire team. I'm gonna invite Hank Willis Thomas, Michael Murphy, Jonathan Evans, Chris Goebel, the entire design team, and the entire Songa team to come behind me, and Hank's gonna say a few remarks.
Believe it or not, Boston was an incubator of arts, theater, and music. People came here before they went to New York City. Legends like Miles Davis, August Wilson, Duke Ellington, Charlie Parker, and Roxbury's own Roy Haynes spent time in the jazz corner of the South End. The soul of this city helped cultivate their craft. James Brown calmed the fiery crowd at the Boston Garden following the assassination of Dr. King. Many of our nation's greatest talents and heroes have roots here. From Phyllis Wheatley to W.E.B. Du Bois, Bill Russell, Michael Bivins, and David Big Papi Ortiz followed in the footsteps of giants. This is our city.
Fortunately, everybody, thinks that Black Boston started in the 70s with busing, and then it fell apart from there, but that's not true. There were incredible artists and dancers and sculptors that were here in the late 20s and did amazing things. And then coming back, into Roxbury in the 90s, it started to feel like that community was coming back, right? We had this period where it was, it was a horrible time in Boston's history and Black history, but it really felt like people were starting to come together, and you had old families that had been here, you had new families that were moving in and renting, and it just felt like, okay, this is Dudley Square, and things were happening and things were moving, and you had Nubian Notion, and it was like, this is exactly the way it's supposed to be.
When you grow up on a stretch of Mass Ave, it's down the street from all these legendary jazz clubs when Boston was a jazz mecca, where if you go back and look at the seminal jazz recordings of the 40s and 50s, a high percentage of them happened in those Boston jazz clubs.
I did a screening of this film for Tim Reed called Asunder, and it was early, it was must have been mid-2000s, and it was a snowstorm, and we were supposed to be screening at the Blackman Auditorium over at Northeastern, and they had shut the whole university down, and Tim had already flown in, and I was like, oh my gosh, there's not going to be anyone there. We were having dinner, and I said, it's all right. If there's 4 people there, at least we're screening your film. And Keith Motley was amazing. He kept the university open so that we could screen. When we got to the university, there were 700 people, Black people, waiting to get into the Blackman Auditorium. And Tim looks at me and he's like, what is this? There are Black people in Boston. And we laughed because it was so funny, because he was just like, really? You think there's going to be people to come out and see this film? I said, yeah, there's Black people in Boston.
So in this Renaissance time that we're living in, of artists taking the helm of spreading their social justice opinions, whether they're in collectives or whether they're individually doing it, it is a way to levy and take up space that might not be allowed otherwise.
Right, we have so many monuments where we're looking up to men on horses and men with capes, and men with guns.
even the artist, Hank Willis Thomas. He has offered this city a look at love that was active, a look at love that produced results. And I commend him for that. The Black aesthetic is dimensional, it has breadth, it has width, it has height, that he's taken on that charge of showing the world that this is about our ability to bring our true essence forward.
There's an intimacy that is often overlooked in the way that they either locked arms, they held hands, they embraced each other, and I really wanted to highlight that. And then I always like to point out that in that picture, when you look at it closely, you can see that most of his weight is on her shoulders. And I thought that that was a pretty poetic truth, really, that when you think of the legacy of Martin Luther King, a lot of that has been carried on the weight of Mrs. King and his children.
Mrs. King is a Black artist. She was here at New England Conservatory. She's a singer, and throughout many of the rallies, she began in song, she began in music, she began in art. And so art is one of the ways in which our voices, our culture, our heart, our soul has been translated throughout the country. The plaza itself is in the shape of a quilt. The African-American quilting tradition, and these quilts told messages, they told stories.
This particular structure is going to tell a story and have you reimagine a story and have you think while you're walking away from it and while you're in front of it, and have you going home and talking about it. I think that's what art should do, right? Art should make you stop, think, listen, and then go talk about it.
I was born by the river in a little tent, and oh, just like the river I've been running ever since. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come. Oh, yes it will. It's been too hard living, but I'm afraid to die, 'cause I don't know what's up there beyond the sky. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come. Oh, yes it will. See, I'd go to the movies and I go downtown. Somebody keep telling me please don't hang around. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come. Oh, yes it will. Then I go to my brother and I say, brother, help me please. But he winds up knocking me back down on my knees. Whoa!
We are so much more than our hurt. We are also our happiness, our joy, our love, our strength, our perseverance, our prayers. our spirit. We are so much more than our hurt. And we need to convey that not simply to black kids, but to white kids, that they understand that black people are more than simply their hurt. They're full human beings with all the hopes, aspirations that they have. We have them as well.
I don't think we can afford to be tired. We have to activate, and we have to constantly activate, and it might be tiring, but we can't afford to say that we're too tired. We have the wherewithal to use our resources to energize each other, to inspire each other, to keep going forward. It's a press. You can stop maybe 1 or 2, but you can't stop 10,000. When people in this world decide that we're going to come together and do something about our situation, tired is not in it.
Whenever we think about figures who were notable or of the civil rights movement, or we think about that time period, and we show black people in particular, we never show them smiling, as if they did not know love, as if they only knew struggle. And so I think it's extremely significant to have sort of an embrace that recognizes a moment where someone like King and others like King should be celebrated, to recognize a moment where they had joy.
Black joy is part of that black history, that story, that narrative, in everything we do, whether we're thinking back to the church, and biblical scripture that tells us, while weeping may endureth for the night, joy cometh in the morning. Well, yes, indeed, that is part of who we are as black people. And we have to tap into that joy and be intentional about it, because this fight, this journey, it is hard. This has been a hard walk for many of us, because 400 years of oppression and all the things that the kings were fighting against, 50 plus years ago, those things are still with us to this day. And how we get through them is by centering joy.
We are talking about a future where I think most people will agree that both white people and black people have to change. It's a big deal. It's a remarkable piece of art. And so I think that in the next few years, you're going to get crowds coming to see it. And so how do you make it a symbol for the sake of the advancement of black people? Okay? Because I do think that there is no moral advancement of white people without advancement of black people.
This is Boston. Barbecue summers, beef patties, businesswomen, churchgoers, esteemed politicians, 9-to-5 grinders, culture generators, championship parades, and beautiful people from Cape Verde, Jamaica, Haiti, DR, Vietnam, Nigeria, and much, much more. Black American descendants of enslaved ancestors, Mash P and Wampanoag. Boston is Malcolm and Martin, not just Matt and Ben. There was a new edition before the new kids were on the block. There are no summers without Donna Summer. Free just worked at 106 in Park. She lives here. We are here. No stereotype can erase us. We embrace Nubian Square, but we'll always say down Dudley. When we say, no sir, we're not just being polite. We are a stomping ground for black revolutionaries. Crispus Attucks rebelled so Mel King could run and Mayor Janey could make history. We stand in the face of the most perfected form of racism to date and still have the power to lift up one another. There are black people in Boston. There is a rich culture in Boston. Get ready to embrace a new legacy. This is just the beginning. So don't park your car just yet.
away from this place. I know. Let me go.